Right now, while you are watching this, there is a phonograph record traveling through interstellar space. It is copper, plated with gold, and it is bolted to the outside of a spacecraft that left Earth in 1977. Nobody will ever play it. The people who made it understood that perfectly well, and they built it anyway. The hard part was never the music. The hard part was that they were writing to a reader whose senses they could not imagine. You cannot assume eyes. You cannot assume ears. You cannot assume that whatever finds this has a body, or that time runs for it at anything like our speed. So the committee fell back on the one thing they could be certain was already shared. They fell back on physics. On the cover of the record, there is a drawing of a hydrogen atom. At the moment, its electron flips its spin. That event takes less than a billionth of a second, and it happens exactly the same way everywhere in the universe. It is the closest thing there is to a word that everyone already knows. Every instruction on that cover is measured in multiples of it. How fast to turn the record. How to read the map of 14 pulsars that gives our position in the galaxy. They wrote the manual in the only language they could be sure was not theirs alone. The people who did it remembered it afterwards as a matter of weeks. The launch date could not move because the planets were lined up in a way that would not happen again for another 175 years, and a spacecraft that missed that window would have to wait for a generation that had not been born yet. So a small group of people in Ithaca, New York, had roughly a month to decide what a species sounds like. Not what it says about itself, what it sounds like. That distinction did most of the work. If you set out to explain humanity, you write a document, and every document is an argument, and every argument is a case for the defense. If instead you record what a place sounds like, you get something stranger and more honest. So they recorded thunder, rain and surf and wind, a heartbeat, footsteps, a mother speaking to her newborn child, the sound of a kiss. And 90 minutes of music from wherever they could find it in 6 weeks, which meant phone calls and favors and a great deal of luck. There is Bach 3 times. There is Mozart and Beethoven and a Javanese gamelan. There are Navajo singers and Peruvian panpipes and a Senegalese percussion piece and an initiation song sung by girls of the Mbuti people in the rainforest of Central Africa. There is a Bulgarian shepherdess named Valia Balkanska singing a song about a rebel in a voice that does not sound like it is coming from a human throat at all. And there is Chuck Berry playing Johnny B. Good, which several members of the committee argued was adolescent and did not belong. Carl Sagan is said to have replied that there are a lot of adolescents on the planet. And then there is track number 23, which is the one that changes the shape of this story. It is a piece of American gospel blues called Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground. It was recorded in Dallas in 1927 by a street singer named Blind Willie Johnson. It has no words. Johnson hums it and plays slide guitar with a pocket knife, and the whole thing lasts about 3 minutes. Blind Willie Johnson lost his sight as a child. He spent his life singing on street corners for coins. In 1945, his house burned down, and having nowhere else to go, he went on living in the ruins of it, sleeping in the wet ash. He developed a fever, and when he was taken to the hospital, he was refused admission. Accounts differ on whether that was because he was blind or because he was black. He died a few days later, and he was buried in an unmarked grave. 32 years after that, his voice left the solar system. Somebody had to go and get all of this. The committee is the part that gets remembered, and it was chaired by Carl Sagan, and that is how the story is almost always told. But the greetings on that record, the 55 languages, were assembled by a woman named Linda Salzman Sagan and she wrote the account of how it was done herself in the first person. In it, she names the people who did the actual work: Shirley Arden, who was Carl's executive assistant; Wendy Gradison, who was his editorial assistant; and Stephen Soter. She describes what the job really consisted of, which was finding individual speakers, contacting them, and convincing them, and then getting them into a room with a microphone, over and over in a matter of weeks. 3 of those 4 names belong to women whose job titles were assistant, and the reason there is a human voice on that record at all is that they made a very large number of telephone calls. It did not all work. Some people said yes and then could not come, and forgot to say so in time for anyone to find a replacement. Which is why, on the most widely distributed recording of the human species ever made, there is no Swahili. There was no time. That is the whole reason. The sequence opens in Akkadian, a language that was spoken in Sumer about 6,000 years ago and has had no native speakers for millennia. It says, "May all be very well." And it ends, 55 languages later, in Wu, a modern Chinese dialect. From a dead language to a living one in under 4 minutes, assembled by 4 people in a hurry. Carl Sagan said afterwards that Johnson's song was chosen because it was about a kind of loneliness that human beings feel when they are confronted with the night, and that he suspected such loneliness might be common in the galaxy. That is the sentence to hold on to, because it tells you what this object actually is. It is not a greeting. It is not an advertisement. It is a message from a species that had begun to suspect it might be lonely, sent to a listener it had no reason to believe existed. And it was sent by people who knew the odds. Voyager will not come near another star for about 40,000 years. When it does, it will pass a dim red dwarf in the constellation Camelopardalis at a distance of roughly 1.5 light years, which is not close. It will still be traveling after the sun has died. The gold plating was chosen because gold does not corrode. The engineers calculated that in the vacuum of interstellar space, with almost nothing to erode it, the record should remain readable for something on the order of 1 billion years. Which means that for as long as anything human is likely to exist, and for a very long time after that, there will be a copper disk moving through the dark with a blind man's voice on it. That is what 1977 did. The question is, why it did it then. The idea that you could actually look did not exist until 1959. Before that, the question of whether anyone else was out there belonged to philosophy, or to religion, or to pulp magazines with rockets on the cover. It was a fine thing to wonder about over a drink. It was not something you could get a telescope for. What changed was 2 pages in the journal Nature, written by 2 physicists at Cornell named Giuseppe Cocconi and Philip Morrison. Their argument was very simple, and it is the reason any of this became serious. If someone wanted to be heard across interstellar distances, they would have to choose a frequency to broadcast on. And a frequency is a choice, and a choice requires that both parties think alike, which is exactly what you cannot assume. Unless there is a frequency that nature itself points at. There is. Hydrogen is the most common substance in the universe, and it emits radiation at 1,420 megahertz. Any civilization that builds a radio telescope will find that line almost immediately because the galaxy is shouting it everywhere. It is a landmark that does not require agreement. Cocconi and Morrison proposed that this was where to listen, not because anyone had heard anything, but because it was the only place 2 strangers could agree to meet without having spoken first. Their paper ends with a sentence that has been quoted ever since. "The probability of success," they wrote, "is difficult to estimate. But if we never search, the chance of success is zero. Notice what has happened here. It is the same move that would be made on the record cover 18 years later. Faced with a mind you cannot model, you look for the one thing you can be certain is shared, and you build everything on top of it. In 1959, that thing was hydrogen. In 1977, it was hydrogen again. The following spring, a 29-year-old astronomer named Frank Drake pointed an 85-foot dish in Green Bank, West Virginia, at two nearby stars, Tau Ceti and Epsilon Eridani, and listened on that frequency for about 150 hours. He called it Project Ozma, after the Queen of Oz, because Oz was a place very far away, difficult to reach, and full of exotic beings. He did it quietly. He had not asked for much permission. And within days, he heard something. A strong, pulsed signal coming from the direction of Epsilon Eridani. Drake later described the feeling in the control room, the sudden and complete conviction that it had happened on the first try in the first week. It was a passing aircraft. That is the part of the story that gets left out, and it is the most useful part. Drake had discovered in the first week of the first search that the sky is full of us. Every subsequent decade of listening would be a fight against our own noise. A year later, Drake called a meeting at Green Bank to work out whether any of this was worth doing. 11 people came. One of them was a 26-year-old named Carl Sagan. To organize the discussion, Drake wrote something on the blackboard that has been on physics classroom walls ever since. It is a line of terms multiplied together: the rate at which stars form, the fraction with planets, the fraction of those where life begins, the fraction where life becomes intelligent, the fraction that develops signals we could detect, and the length of time such a civilization keeps broadcasting. It is called the Drake equation, and it is routinely misunderstood. It does not tell you how many civilizations there are. Almost none of its terms were known then, and several are not known now. What it does is organize an ignorance. It takes a question that feels unanswerable and breaks it into pieces, some of which are astronomy, some of which are biology, and the last of which is not a science question at all. That last term asks how long a technological civilization survives. Drake put it there in 1961, 1 year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, and everyone in the room understood what it meant. The search for other minds had a term in it for whether minds last. 14 years later, they stopped listening for a moment and spoke. On the 16th of November, 1974, the Arecibo telescope in Puerto Rico transmitted a message toward a cluster of stars called Messier 13. It was 1,679 bits long. That number was chosen because it is the product of 23 and 73, both prime, so that anyone receiving it would have only one sensible way to arrange it into a rectangle, and the rectangle makes a picture. The picture shows the numbers 1 to 10, the elements of DNA, the shape of the double helix, a human figure, the solar system, and the telescope that sent it. It was transmitted during a ceremony to celebrate a resurfacing of the dish. It lasted under 3 minutes. Messier 13 is 25,000 light years away, which means that a reply, if anyone is there and inclined to answer, would arrive in roughly 50,000 years. Nobody involved thought a reply was coming. Frank Drake said afterward that the message was really aimed at Earth to show that we could do it. And that is worth sitting with, because it is the third time in 15 years that the same thing happens. A serious scientist does something that cannot possibly work in his own lifetime, and does it carefully anyway, and then explains that it was mostly for us. By 1974, this way of asking the question had a name, a frequency, an equation, federal funding, and a page in Nature. It was, by any measure that counts, respectable. At the same time, in the same decade, in the same country, there were people losing their jobs for asking a version of the same question with a different word in it. In 1948, the United States Air Force hired an astronomer named Joseph Allen Hynek to help it explain away flying saucers. He was a good choice. Hynek taught at Ohio State. He had no patience for the subject, and he later said that he had taken the job partly for the money and partly because he expected it to be easy. His own words for the reports, at the beginning, were that they were utterly nonsense. He held that job through 3 successive Air Force programs for more than 20 years. The last of them was called Project Blue Book, and by the time it closed, it had collected more than 12,000 reports, most of them dissolved on contact. Aircraft, balloons, the planet Venus, which is responsible for a truly remarkable number of them. Hynek explained thousands of cases, and he was good at it. But a residue would not go away. A few hundred reports from people with no reason to invent anything that survived every explanation he could construct. What changed Hynek was not the strange cases. It was the witnesses. He kept meeting people, and a striking number of them were pilots, air traffic controllers, and police officers who had clearly seen something they could not account for, and whose main concern was not what it was, but whether anyone would find out they had reported it. In March of 1966, in Michigan, there was a wave of sightings, and the Air Force sent Hynek to explain them. At a press conference in Detroit, he suggested that some of the reports might involve marsh gas, which can ignite in wetlands and produce a glow. He offered it as one possibility among several. The papers printed it as the answer. Swamp gas became a national joke within a week, and it stayed a joke for decades. Hynek said later that it was the worst mistake of his professional life, and it is not clear he ever recovered from it. The congressman for that district was so annoyed by the handling of it that he demanded hearings. His name was Gerald Ford, and he would be president within a decade. Out of that embarrassment came the study that closed the question. In 1966, the Air Force gave the University of Colorado a contract to settle the matter scientifically. It was led by Edward Condon, a physicist of real standing, a veteran of the Manhattan Project, and a former head of the National Bureau of Standards. 2 years later, the Condon report ran to nearly 1,500 pages, and its conclusion was that further study of unidentified flying objects could not be justified, and that nothing of scientific value had come from 21 years of investigation. The National Academy of Sciences reviewed it and agreed. Blue Book was shut down in December of 1969, and the subject left science, not because it had been answered, but because it had been closed. There are 2 things inside that report that are worth knowing. The first is a memorandum. In August of 1966, before the study began, the project coordinator Robert Lowe wrote a note to 2 university administrators about how to take on the work without damaging the university's reputation. The trick, he wrote, would be to describe the project so that to the public it would appear a totally objective study, but to the scientific community would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer. The memo was found in a project file by staff members in 1967 and passed to outsiders, and it was published while the study was still running. 2 members of the team were dismissed. Condon maintained that the memo did not represent how the work was actually done, and there is no evidence he wrote it or approved it. The second thing is arithmetic. Of the cases the Condon report examined in detail, roughly a third were left unidentified in the body of the report itself. That figure appears in the case studies. Condon's summary, which stated the opposite conclusion, was placed at the front. Almost nobody read past it. So this is the state of the world in 1974, in one country, in the same decade. There is a question about whether other minds exist. Asked with a radio telescope and the word hydrogen, it has federal funding, a paper in Nature, an equation on classroom blackboards, and a message beamed at a star cluster during a televised ceremony. Asked by an airline captain with a logbook, it will cost him his medical certification if he puts it in writing. Same question, same uncertainty, opposite consequences. And the consequence had a consequence. Pilots stopped reporting. Officers stopped writing things down. The absence of good data became the reason not to look, and not looking guaranteed the absence of good data, and that loop ran for about 40 years. Carl Sagan sat exactly on that line, and he did not sit there comfortably. He co-founded the modern search for extraterrestrial intelligence. He also spent a great deal of energy arguing that flying saucer reports did not meet any reasonable standard of evidence, and he was often blunt about it. Those two positions were not a contradiction for him. They came from the same rule, which is that a claim of that size requires evidence of that size, and an anecdote is not evidence, no matter how sincere the person telling it. But in 1969, the year Blue Book closed, Sagan helped organize a symposium on unidentified flying objects at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, over objections from Condon and from within the government. He did not believe the saucers were real. He believed the question should be allowed in the room. Alan Hynek was at that symposium too. By then he had stopped defending the Air Force. He would go on to build a classification scheme for sightings by proximity. And the third category on that list, for cases involving occupants, he labeled close encounters of the third kind. 8 years later, a young director would call him and ask if he could borrow the phrase for a title. On the 15th of August, 1977, a radio telescope in Ohio recorded 72 seconds of something nobody has ever explained. The telescope was called Big Ear. It belonged to Ohio State University. It was built in a field next to a golf course, and it did not move. It simply lay there and let the sky drift across it, and a computer printed out what it heard on continuous paper, and a volunteer went through the paper by hand, days later, looking for anything that was not noise. The volunteer was an astronomer named Jerry Amon. On the printout for that night, he found a sequence of 6 characters that indicated a signal roughly 30 times stronger than the background sky. It was narrow. It was in the hydrogen band, the frequency Koine and Morrison had nominated 18 years earlier as the only sensible place to listen. It rose and fell over exactly 72 seconds, which is precisely how long a fixed point in the sky takes to cross that telescope's field of view. Which is to say, it behaved, in every respect, the way an interstellar transmission was predicted to behave. Amon circled it in red pen and wrote one word in the margin: wow. It has been called the wow signal ever since. That telescope, and every telescope since, has gone back to that patch of sky in the constellation Sagittarius many times over almost 50 years. It has never been heard again. Nobody claims it was a message. Amon himself spent decades cautioning against that, and he leaned for a long time towards some human source that nobody had identified. What can be said is narrower and stranger. It is the single best candidate that 65 years of listening has produced, and it lasted 72 seconds, and it happened 5 days before Voyager 2 left the ground. Because that is the other thing about that August. On the 20th of August, Voyager 2 launched from Cape Canaveral. On the 5th of September, Voyager 1 followed it, on a faster trajectory, which is why the second one to leave is the one that got ahead. Both of them carried a copper record with 90 minutes of music bolted to the hull. So within 3 weeks of each other, in the same summer, humanity recorded 72 seconds of an unexplained narrowband signal from Sagittarius and threw 2 gramophone records at the galaxy. Nobody planned that. There is no committee anywhere that arranged for those things to happen in the same month. And then, in November, the third thing happened, and this one was not an accident, because millions of people bought a ticket for it. Close Encounters of the Third Kind opened on the 16th of November, 1977. The title was borrowed. It came from a classification scheme built by Alan Hynek, the astronomer the Air Force had hired to explain saucers away, who had ranked sightings by proximity and reserved the third category for cases involving occupants. Hynek was hired as the film's technical consultant, and he is in it. Near the end, in the crowd at the landing site, there is a man with a white beard and a pipe looking up. That is him. 1977 had already had Star Wars in May, which was a fairy tale in space and made no claim about our world. Close Encounters made a claim about our world. Its premise is that this is happening now in Indiana to people who fix power lines and raise children, and that the government knows, and that ordinary people are being drawn towards something they cannot explain and cannot stop moving toward at great cost to their marriages and their sanity. That is a film about the Condon Report. It is a film about being the person whose experience has been officially declared not worth studying. And in the last 20 minutes, it does something that no committee in Washington would have authorized. Contact, when it finally comes, is not made in words. It is made with 5 notes. A man at a console plays a phrase. The ship answers it. And for a while, the two of them simply exchange musical figures at increasing volume. And that is the conversation. There is no translation. There is no language. There are 2 parties finding out that they can both do this thing with tones and building from there. That was written and shot in 1976 and 1977 by people who had, as far as anyone knows, no involvement whatsoever with the committee at Cornell that spent that same year deciding what to bolt onto a spacecraft. Both arrived at the same answer. If you cannot assume a shared language, send music. The film made an enormous amount of money and was nominated for 8 Academy Awards. The record left the solar system. The signal was never heard again. And the official position of the United States government, throughout all of it, was that there was nothing here worth investigating, and had not been since 1969. 3 years later, Carl Sagan got a television series, and it changed what a generation thought the sky was. Cosmos ran for 13 episodes on public television in 1980. It has been watched, by the usual estimate, by something like 500 million people in 60 countries. For a decade, it was the most watched program public television in America had ever made. What made it work was not the graphics, which have not aged well, and not the spaceship of the imagination, which is frankly a bit silly. What made it work is that Sagan refused to talk down. He would explain the actual argument, not the conclusion, the argument. How Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the earth with a stick and a shadow. What was lost when the library at Alexandria burned, and who Hypatia was, and what it means that we do not have the books. He would let a thing be beautiful and difficult at the same time, and he trusted that you would stay. And in the 12th episode, he came back to the question he had spent his life on. He called that episode Encyclopedia Galactica, and it is about the Drake equation, and about what it would mean if the sky were full of civilizations exchanging what they knew. He was, in 1980, still hopeful. He was also a man who had watched the government close the other version of the question 11 years earlier, and who had helped keep this version alive by being careful. 10 years after Cosmos, he asked for a favor. Voyager 1 had finished its work. It was past the planets, and its cameras were about to be switched off for good. Sagan lobbied for years to have it turn around first and photograph the Earth. There was no scientific value in it. Several people at NASA said so, correctly. On Valentine's Day, 1990, from a distance of 3.7 billion miles, Voyager 1 took the picture. The Earth in it is less than a single pixel. It is a pale, slightly bluish speck, sitting by chance in a band of scattered sunlight, which is a lens artifact and not a beam of light. Sagan's description of it was that it was a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Everyone who has ever lived, he pointed out, lived there. Every war, every empire, every certainty on that dot. He died 6 years later, at 62, of a disease of the bone marrow. He did not live to see any of what happened next, and he did not live to see the thing that would have interested him most. Because while he was alive, nobody actually knew whether planets were common. That sounds impossible now. The Drake equation had a term in it for the fraction of stars with planets, and when Drake wrote it on a blackboard in 1961, that number was a guess with nothing behind it. We had one solar system and no way to check. The first confirmed planet, orbiting an ordinary sun-like star, was found in 1995 by 2 Swiss astronomers. One planet, then a dozen, then hundreds. Then the Kepler telescope, launched in 2009, stared at a single patch of sky and returned an answer that has changed the arithmetic permanently. Planets are not rare. Planets are the normal outcome of making a star. There are, on the current numbers, billions of them in our galaxy alone, and a great many are roughly the size of Earth, and a substantial fraction of those sit at distances from their star where liquid water is possible. So one term of Drake's equation, the first one anybody could actually settle, came back with the optimistic answer. And the sky stayed quiet. That is the part that is genuinely difficult, and it is the reason this is not a story with a comfortable shape. 65 years of listening. Better instruments every decade, surveys covering millions of stars, computers sifting frequencies Drake could not have dreamed of. And what we have is one signal from 1977 that lasted 72 seconds and never came back. Enrico Fermi is supposed to have put it at lunch at Los Alamos in 1950 in the middle of a conversation about something else. Where is everybody? There is no agreed answer. There are perhaps 40 proposed ones, and they range from the reassuring to the very dark. And the honest position is that we do not know which is true, and that the sample size for civilizations is 1. Meanwhile, the 2 spacecraft kept going. Voyager 1 crossed out of the Sun's influence and into interstellar space in 2012. Voyager 2, slower and headed in a different direction, crossed in 2018. Which means that the record, the copper disc with the Bulgarian shepherdess and the blind street singer and the mother speaking to her child, is no longer in our solar system. It left. It is out in the space between stars, and it is still moving, and it will still be readable long after everyone reading it here is gone. For about 40 years, that was the state of the question. A quiet sky, an object in the dark, and an official position that nothing else was worth investigating. Then in 2017, a newspaper published 3 videos. On the 16th of December, 2017, the New York Times published a story about a Pentagon program that most of the Pentagon had not known existed. It was called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. The paper reported that it had received just under $22 million, beginning in late 2008 and running through 2011, which in defense terms is close to nothing. It existed largely because one senator, Harry Reid of Nevada, wanted it to. Be careful with that program, because its status is genuinely murky. The office the Pentagon later built to handle all of this has stated flatly that this program was never an official Department of Defense program at all, and that the funded contract of those years went by a different name. The money is documented. The chain of authority is not. Two things about that story matter more than the program. The first is that one of its three authors, Leslie Kean, had spent years on this subject and had been treated accordingly. The second is that it came with video. In April of 2020, the Department of Defense formally released three of them. One was recorded in November of 2004, two in January of 2015. They have names now: Flyer 1, Gimbal, and Go Fast. You should be careful about what those videos show, and by now we can be precise about it, because one of the three has been solved. In February of 2025, the Pentagon's own office published its assessment of Go Fast. It concluded, with high confidence, that there was nothing anomalous about it. The object was not skimming the ocean. It was at 13,000 feet. Its actual speed through the air was somewhere between 5 and 92 miles an hour. And in every simulation they ran, it never once moved against the wind. It looked fast because the camera was moving. That is all it was. The other two have not been explained, and the office has not put them on its list of resolved cases. So the honest sentence is not that the videos are ambiguous. It is that one of the three was a trick of perspective, and two of them are still open. And then there is the thing the Navy did, which has nothing to do with physics and everything to do with the last 50 years. In March of 2019, it created a formal channel for aircrew to report. And in July of the following year, its Public Affairs Office issued guidance on vocabulary, which said, in as many words, do not refer to these as UFOs. The interesting part is not the new phrase. The interesting part is that the guidance explained why. The reason given, in writing, was so that aviators would not be hesitant to report the intrusions. Read that again, because it is the whole argument of this film in a single administrative document. Somebody in the United States Navy sat down and worked out that the vocabulary was the obstacle, that the word itself was costing them data. And so they changed the word on purpose to get the reports. The reports arrived immediately. In June of 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence delivered a preliminary assessment to Congress covering 144 reports from government sources between November of 2004 and March of 2021. Of those 144, it was able to explain one. It was a large, deflating balloon. The report is careful, and it deserves care in return. It does not say anything is extraterrestrial. It says the data is limited and inconsistent, and that most cases lack enough information for any conclusion at all. That is not a revelation. It is an admission of ignorance on government letterhead about objects in restricted airspace, which had not happened since 1969. In July of 2022, the Department of Defense established a standing office for it. The question now had a budget line, an address, and a director who had to answer questions. Then, on the 26th of July, 2023, 3 men were sworn in before a subcommittee of the House of Representatives. Ryan Graves, a former Navy pilot, testified that unidentified objects were being encountered in the training ranges off the Atlantic coast, and that this was treated as a flight safety problem. David Fravor, a former commander, described what he saw off the coast of California in 2004 with his own eyes and what it did. Two details are worth having right. The famous Flyer 1 footage was not shot by his aircraft. It was recorded by a different crew. And under oath, he did not give the object a size. The comparison to a fighter jet, which is quoted everywhere, comes from interviews, not from the hearing. The third witness was David Grush, a former Air Force intelligence officer, and this is where precision matters most, because his testimony is the most dramatic thing said in that room and the most easily distorted. Grush testified that the United States has run a program across decades to recover and study craft of non-human origin. He was asked directly whether he had seen such a craft. He did not say no. What he said was that he had to be careful about describing what he had seen firsthand in that setting, and that he could answer the question behind closed doors. That is a refusal, not a denial, and the difference is not a technicality. On one point, he was completely unambiguous, and it was about bodies. That, he said, was something he had not witnessed himself. The rest of his account rests on interviews with other people, whose names he said he had given to the Intelligence Community Inspector General and to Congress in classified session. So the honest description of that day is this. Two pilots gave first-hand accounts, under oath. One former official gave a second-hand account of a program he was told about, under oath, and declined in open session to say what he had personally seen. Being under oath carries a criminal risk if you lie. It does not make you right. In February of 2024, the Pentagon's office published the first volume of a historical review. It found no evidence that any American program has ever recovered extraterrestrial technology. The second volume was to address the claims that the first one did not, including Grush's. It is now more than 2 years past its own deadline, and it has not appeared. What happened after that is not a discovery. It is more paperwork, and the paperwork is the story. In September of 2025, there was another hearing with sworn testimony, and for the first time, a serving Navy senior chief described an encounter from a ship in 2023. Not one government official appeared. In December of 2025, the annual defense law added 3 sections on this subject. Air Defense Command now has to report intercepts retroactively back to the 1st of January 2004. Data has to go to the office immediately, and the office has to inventory the classification rules that have been used to keep this material secret. In February of 2026, the President posted on social media that the files should be released. There is no executive order. There is no presidential memorandum. There is a post which a department chose to treat as an instruction, and that is the actual mechanism, and it is worth knowing that it was that thin. Since the 8th of May, 2026, the department has been publishing declassified case files on a public website in tranches roughly every few weeks. It has been visited over 1 billion times. And here is what the department itself puts at the top of it, that these are unresolved cases. Each video carries a note saying that the description attached to it is not an analytic judgment. The government is publishing its own unanswered questions and labeling them as unanswered. That is not disclosure. It is something stranger and, for our purposes, more interesting. It is an institution admitting in public that it does not know. And in July of 2026, that same office published its annual figures. 319 new reports, 205 of them still open. The largest single cause of resolution by a wide margin, was a new technique that accounted for 238 cases as satellite flaring, sunlight bouncing off satellites in low orbit. Also on that year's list of solved cases, 1 commercial rocket launch and 1 manned jetpack. Which is the 3rd time in this story. In 1960, the first thing Frank Drake ever heard was an aeroplane. In 2021, the 1 case out of 144 was a deflating balloon. In 2026, the great majority of what got solved was sunlight on our own machinery. The sky, again and again, turns out to be full of us. Nothing has been proven. No object has been produced. The most extraordinary testimony is still second-hand, and the volume that was supposed to examine it is 2 years late. What has changed is not the sky. What has changed is the paperwork. A question that was formally closed in 1969 now has an office, a reporting channel, a line in the defense budget, hearings under oath, and a government website publishing its own unsolved cases by the tranche. Nobody had to prove anything for that to happen. Somebody only had to make it safe to write down. While all of that was happening, something else arrived, and it arrived so quickly that most people have not finished having an opinion about it. We built a mind. That sentence is contested, and it should be. Whether what we have built thinks, or understands, or experiences anything at all, is exactly the kind of question that cannot be settled by asserting an answer confidently, and there are serious people at every position. But here is what is not contested by anyone who works on these systems. We do not fully know how they do what they do. We built them by showing them almost everything we have ever written and letting them find their own structure in it, and the structure they found is not one we designed or can read. There is an entire research field, and it is young, whose whole purpose is to work out what is happening inside a thing we made ourselves. So consider where that leaves us. In 1977, a small group of people in a hurry tried to write a message to a mind whose senses, whose body, and whose sense of time they could not imagine. Their solution was to find the one thing they could be sure was shared, and hydrogen was it, and they built everything on top of that. Right now, a great many people spend their days doing something structurally identical. They sit in front of a mind they did not fully design, whose internals they cannot inspect, and they try to find the phrasing that will be understood. We even have a word for it now. And somewhere between those two things, a question that was declared closed in 1969 has been reopened, not by evidence, but by the removal of a penalty for speaking. 3 versions of one problem. A mind we could not imagine, a mind we made and cannot read, and a mind that may have been here the entire time, which we spent 40 years arranging not to hear about. It is a great deal to be handed in one lifetime, and it is reasonable to find it heavy. There are people who will tell you that all of this is obviously nothing, and people who will tell you it is obviously everything, and both of them are enjoying a certainty that the evidence does not support. The honest position is less comfortable and much more interesting. We do not know. And for the first time in the history of the species, not knowing has an address, a budget, and a public hearing schedule. What would it actually mean if it turned out we are not alone? Not the panic version, which mostly says more about us than about any visitor. The real version. It would mean that the thing every culture has asked, in its own grammar, for as long as there have been cultures, has an answer, and that we were the ones who found out. It would mean that consciousness is not a local accident. It would mean that the loneliness Sagan heard in a blind street singer's guitar really was, as he suspected, a common feeling in this galaxy. and it would not answer anything about how to live, which is the part people always expect it to answer, and it never will. The morning after, there would still be children to raise and work to do and people to forgive. That is not a disappointment. That is the thing that survives every revolution in what we know. We may not get an answer. It is entirely possible that the sky is quiet because it is empty, and that the WOW signal was a satellite nobody logged, and that every video has a mundane explanation waiting for someone patient enough to find it. That would also be a fact about the universe, and it would make what we have here rarer than anyone has dared to assume. Either way, this is the generation that is finding out. Not the one that guessed. The one that looked with instruments and wrote down what came back and stopped punishing the people who reported it. The record is still out there. Voyager 1 is somewhere past the edge of the sun's influence, moving at about 17 kilometers per second, carrying its copper disk. On it, still, is a Bulgarian shepherdess, and a Javanese gamelan, and a mother speaking to her child, and Chuck Berry, and 3 minutes of humming from a man who was buried in an unmarked grave. And there is one more thing in that aluminum jacket, which the people who packed it in 1977 put there deliberately, knowing everything they knew about the distances and the odds and the 40,000 years. They included a cartridge and a needle.